We're going to be beginning our two-part look. We'll continue it next week, 1 week from today. And we're going to cover 200 years of history in 4 hours, right? So it's a large task. What we'll be talking about today is the origins up to about 1900. More or less, the Great Migration will be our cutting off point between this section and the next section, although we'll see a little bit about why that's complicated. So to frame what we're going to talk about here, Ypsilanti as a Black city. We are going through a situation right now in the United States where our racial history is again being mythologized, is again being erased. And that has happened before in our past, and that has had incredibly detrimental consequences. For example, the way that Reconstruction has been taught or was taught for generations was historically inaccurate. And it served the way it was taught served the interests of the white supremacists at the time. We're in a situation very similar. We have a country and a city and a state which is defined in part by race and where you live, what kind of work you do, your access to services, where the highway is, where the grocery store is, where the school is. All of that depends on race. All of the decisions we make, because we live in a racialized society where some people have more power than others, are based on those power dynamics. And so you can see race, just like you can see class, just like you can see gender, all kinds of history. You can see in our landscape. You can see where things are, right? Nothing is in our landscape by an accident. And so Ypsi's South Side is the South Side for a reason. And we're going to go into a little bit of that. Again, it is impossible for me to cover all of what we're going to cover, but I hope to do justice to this history. And what we'll be doing is going very deep and very specifically into Ypsilanti's history. So let's think a little bit about our background. And this is exactly 200 years since Ypsilanti was formally founded. May 1825 is the first vote that sets up the county government, the township government, and that vote is taken where Riverside Arts Theater is today. But Ypsilanti, again, is 200 years old. People have been living on this river for 13,000 years. So Ypsilanti is a blink of an eye. One way to think about it is if the human habitation were reduced to 1 year on this river. So all of human history, 1 year on this river. Ypsilanti arrives after Christmas, right? After Christmas. So most of human history, the vast majority of human history on the Huron River is an indigenous history. It has nothing to do with Ypsilanti, black or white. There was a village very close to here. It was called Magwago's Town. It was likely where Galt Village is today. That village existed up until the removal of Native Americans from this area in the period after what we call the War of 1812. And we often, think that these things happened out west, but of course they happened here. And the American Army in October of 1814 came up the Huron River and burned the cornfields and burned the villages. And you notice when they burned them in October. You have no food, right? So that was to remove people from this area. So we all of us, are on the site of land that was 200 years ago this man's land, John Magwago, and his community's land. So I think it's important to recognize that there's not a break between when Ypsilanti begins and when Native people are removed, right? It's one process. Ypsilanti is only here because John Magwago is not. right? And I think that's important to remember. Ypsilanti does not have a Native American history other than the removal of Native Americans from this area. Ypsilanti to exist required the removal of John McGuago. And I think that that should say something to us all about the land we live on. Okay, so slavery and freedom along the Detroit River. When we talk about the first people of African descent along the Huron River and in this area, we're talking about a period that goes far before the United States is even thought of, right? So there have been people of African descent in what is now Michigan before there was a Michigan, right? There have been people of African descent. My guess is very early on with the Europeans who came into this region. So Detroit is founded in 1701. It's founded by Native people and a minority of French who founded a fort there. They begin the process of enslavement, the European style chattel enslavement, where people are commodities, where human beings are bought and sold. There's other kinds of slavery. We have a very specific kind in the United States, a racialized chattel slavery. And the French participate in that. So about 10% of Detroit is enslaved all through the period of the French and British period. The type of slavery changes with British enslaving many more people of African descent. So in the French period, we have many people, many native people who are enslaved by the French. By the British period, we get mainly people of African descent who are enslaved. So there are people of African descent in the Detroit region, you know, by the 17 teens, 20s, right? And I think it's also important to recognize that most white people who lived in Detroit also were not free. They weren't chattel, they weren't enslaved, but they were bonded labor. Nobody came out to Michigan of their own free will, right? That's not what, unless you came out here to make money. You did not come out here of your own free will. So even the French workers were bonded. They had to serve so much time for their masters before they could be free, et cetera, et cetera. So this was not a free place, right? The Northwest Ordinance that cuts up this part of the United States and gives it its shape, outlaws slavery. And I think we all hear that, and we think that slavery then did not exist in Michigan. Well, it outlawed new enslavement. But if you were already held in bondage when that ordinance went into effect, you could remain in bondage. So we have individuals who remain in slavery well into the 1830s in Michigan. And more than that, because slavery is a national system, and we have forts and details like that, all the way up until the Civil War, Southern officers who served in the Michigan area would bring enslaved people here with them. And because it was in the U.S. military, there was no recourse for them to get freedom. So even though the Northwest Ordinance says there's no slavery here, there will be slavery here well into the 1830s, right? So again, this North-South divide, I think we need to come to terms with. It's not a North-South divide at this point. The Detroit River becomes a border between the United States and Canada in this period, right, in the 1812s. And that means that there's different laws on each side. So you actually have people from Canada escaping to the United States to get free, and then people from the United States escaping to Canada to get free, and maybe seeing each other on the Detroit River because that's the craziness of the laws at the time. So if you were a you could not be newly enslaved in Michigan. So if you came from Canada, you could not be enslaved. But if you were already here, you could be enslaved. In 1833, something is called the Blackburn Riots, and that's when slave catchers come up to Michigan and are rebuffed by this area. Michigan does have black codes, and these were legal requirements placed on so-called free black people to live in this state. So in 1827, before Michigan is a state, The black codes required that a white person would sign your surety. You might have to put $500 down to be able to live here, et cetera, et cetera. Those laws in Michigan are repealed in 1838. And that means that Michigan, at least legally, is relatively more free than Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, right around here, which continues those so-called black codes. Now, Michigan becomes a state in 1837, and I think this we need to underline that slavery is a national institution. Michigan becomes part of the United States in the 1790s. Why does it take 40 years for Michigan to become a state? And that is because the way the United States is set up is that each new state that comes into the Union, whether it be slave or free, has to be balanced with another state, right? So that the slave owners could continue their control of the Senate. So for Michigan to become a state, for it to exist as a state at all, Arkansas had to be admitted into the Union as a slave state to balance the Senate. So Michigan even becoming a state is dependent on slavery. That's the kind of institution slavery is. It determines even when those kinds of things, right? It determines much of life in this country. Slavery is outlawed in Canada and most of the British Empire, with the huge caveat of 300 million people in India, on August 1st, 1834. And that means Canada is free, but it also means that places in the Caribbean, Jamaica, Trinidad, those areas are. And that becomes the most important day in this area to celebrate the struggle against slavery. And I think, we talk about Juneteenth. Juneteenth was not celebrated in Ypsilanti until 1990 something. Uh, Emancipation Day was celebrated the following year, 1835. And it's a very specific commemoration that Ypsilanti shares with Canada, with Trinidad, with Jamaica. This area, and it was unlike Juneteenth, which celebrates the ending of slavery in the United States. Emancipation Day celebrates the struggle against slavery in the United States, that the monarchy of Britain would end slavery before the Republic of the United States was was a challenge to the United
Yeah.
States. Now we have in 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 Detroit, we have two pre-Civil War black churches, or three pre-Civil War black churches. That, if as you're a historian, before the Civil War, there are around 200,000 free people of African descent living in the North, right? So if you have two churches, black churches before the Civil War, your community was important to the black population as a whole, and was certainly part of what we would call the Underground Railroad, right? So Ypsilanti and Ann Arbor both each have two black churches that predate the Civil War. Ypsilanti's Brown Chapel AME, which is the third oldest black institution in the state of Michigan, and Second Baptist, which is also formed in the 1850s. So we have two black churches formed in Ypsilanti before the Civil War in a community of about 5,000 people, right? So that means there's weight here already before the Civil War. Now, to go on to Detroit, and when we think about slavery, and we think about the South and the North, and people talk about, in the South, you have to go to Robert E. Lee High School or go to the high school named after the founder of the Klan, et cetera, et cetera. Here are the streets named after local slave owners, not Southern slave owners, but the people who owned human beings in Detroit: Macomb, Campo, Beaubien, McDougal, Abbott, Brush, Hamtramck, Goyne, Meldrum, DeQuinder, Beaufort, Grosbeck, Livernois, Rivard. If you were wealthy back then, you owned, along with land, you owned other people. That was a large part of your wealth, was based on the ownership, not even the work that they did, right? But the ownership of those human bodies, And that was a major source of wealth. And of course, our streets are not named after the enslaved. They are not named after poor people who work on those farms. All of those streets are named after the people who owned those farms in Detroit. Okay, and let's continue. Okay, so again, the first white landowners in Washtenaw County was the Godfrey family. The Godfrey family were slave owners. I think, there was a trading house here to trade with the local Native American population, and it was owned by the Godfrey family. And I guarantee Mr. Godfrey did not hump the furs back and forth between the trading house. Other people did that, right? And it's likely and there's some hints, very, very shady hints, but there are some hints that there are black people at the trading house by the 1780s, 1790s, right? The first actual names, the two names we have of in recorded history of black people in Ypsilanti date from the very beginnings. So the first name of a black man in Washtenaw County is Edward Matavy, and we know his name because he tried to vote at that almost exactly 200 years ago today. It was in May 1825, voting for Washtenaw County to form Washtenaw County at Riverside Arts Center. And his vote is contested by George Meldrum, who says Edward Matavy should not be able to vote because he was born enslaved on my father's farm in Detroit and is not a free white man. So the first black man we have an actual record of dates to the very moment of the start of Ypsilanti and Washtenaw County's formal history. He was born in slavery, not in the South, but in Detroit, and was denied the right to vote. That's Ypsilanti history. That's the earliest history of a black man in Ypsilanti. It's, I hope that challenges what we think about North and South. The very first name of a black woman, and again, black women are much less in the record, right? So there's not a chance that a black woman is going to try to vote in 1825. It says 1925 there. It should be 1825. But remember what I said about people being in bonded labor. So the first uh, woman of African, she's not even a woman, she's a girl, her name is Sarah Davis. And if you look at this notice from the person who she was bonded to, Marvin Miner, a white man in Ypsi here, April 16th, 1838, Sarah Davis, an indentured Negro servant girl of the subscriber, 14 years of age, left his residence in Ypsilanti, Washtenaw County on the evening of the 28th. Whoever shall give the subscriber information of where Sarah Davis may be found shall be liberally rewarded, right? So even though she's not held in slavery, she's bonded. And in fact, this is not the only notice of Sarah Davis escaping that family. So my guess is Sarah Davis had had a head on her to leave. And I would very much like to know what happened to her. Unfortunately, that's the limit of my record. So those are the first black woman and first black man named in Washtenaw County. Again, I am sure there are people of African descent on this land, have seen this land before there was even a United States. Now, when this area is settled in the 1820s and 30s, that's also when we will see the very first black settlers here, right? So Edward Matavy is from Detroit, and we're talking about people settling from outside. And those first black settlers will come with the very first white settlers. They're free black people. They are not from the South. They're from upstate New York, and their families were enslaved by the Dutch in the Hudson River Valley going way back to the 1600s, and they had been freed for generations. And this upstate New York group of people, both white and black, that come and form the main core. The first settlers are speculators, and they're from Virginia, New York, and etc. The cities. But the first people who live here and make real roots here are largely from upstate New York, and they're steeped in something called the Second Great Awakening, which is a religious revival, not the first Great Awakening, but the Second Great Awakening. And it says that religious revival says to communities that are Methodist, to Baptist communities, and it's not a coincidence that there's a Black Baptist church, a Black Methodist church here, is that out of that Great Awakening notion in those churches was the idea that that the return of Jesus was coming, and we had to prepare the earth for his rearrival, and that meant to make it better, to rewrite wrongs, etc. Now, that didn't mean that these communities were determined to stamp out slavery and were in love with helping people and all. It meant that those questions were on the table, what to do about it, right? And so you've got that kind of religious community founding Ypsilanti. And I think that's important, that that Great Awakening community allows for conversations to happen in Ypsilanti that might not happen in the Tidewater of Virginia, right? We get around in Ypsilanti, we get the Normal College, and the Normal College is a teaching college. And that means that women go there. And, you know, if you're a woman and you want to go to college, you have one option in the 1850s, and that's to become a teacher. So you have a lot of middle class educated women in Ypsilanti who have no rights. And when you have, you know, educated people with no rights, they start demanding rights. And so the women here, again, even though it's not a hotbed of abolitionism, the kind of discussions you can have because of the Normal College is here is different than example you would have at University of Michigan, where no women are involved at all, right, until much later. Um, you also get near Raisin, which is this little picture right here. That's a very early anti-slavery society right south of us, near Marshall, Michigan, and founded by several women, radical Quaker women, and it was called the Logan Female Anti-Slavery Society, and they will become part of our community here in the Underground Railroad. There's a very small black population in the county. I think that in the 1820s, black people would be a lot more visible in Michigan than they were in the 1830s and 1840s, as you've got a huge number of white folks coming from New York. So we have a relatively, well, a quite a small black community in Ypsilanti in the 1840s. But beginning in 1850, that black community will triple in size in a decade. And that is the consequence of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. And the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act meant that even if you were free and even if you lived in the North, that or even if you came to the North, that you were the states were obliged to send you back into slavery, no matter if you came to Michigan, et cetera, et cetera. So that meant after 1850 that the only place where a modicum of freedom was possible in a racist slave society was Canada. And so one of the things is that Ypsilanti is on the way to Canada, and our geography is very important. And again, think about how do you get to Canada? There are only one or two places to cross. I mean, we've got, you know, Lake Michigan, we've got Lake Erie. These are boundaries that you can't cross. So there's one or two crossing places. The area near Niagara Falls, and that's what we think of with Harriet Tubman. That's her activity. She's on one side of the Appalachian Mountains. And if you're on that side of the Appalachian Mountains, you're going to go up through Niagara Falls. If you're on our side of the Appalachian Mountains and you're held in bondage in Kentucky or Missouri, you're obviously not going to go all the way down to Niagara. You're going to go through Detroit. So Detroit becomes a choke point where people escaping slavery and people searching for slaves, people escaping slavery, both go. And so Detroit becomes an extremely radical, violent cauldron of slave hunting and anti-slavery activities. And we will see that play a very big part in Detroit or in Ypsilanti. And okay, and here's our first black settlers. And again, the first black settlers in Washtenaw County are some of the wealthiest people in the county at the time. They own, here's the land that they own. If you notice, here's 23, here's Michigan Avenue, there's the Array Farm, the Day Farm, and the Brooks Farms. And those are the original settlers. You know, these black farming families are the very first U.S. citizens to live on that land, right? They are the patent holders of that land. And so you've got and this is Asher Array of the Array family. So you've got relatively wealthy black families, right, who own as much land as anybody around here. The Arrays have a mill, right? So other white farmers around them are dependent on the Array mill for cider and for all kinds of things. So you have people who have real authority in the community who have wealth but have no rights. And it's not an accident that the Array family, the Day family, the Brooks family are going to be the center. As soon as they arrive here, they're the center of an anti-slavery, a black liberation movement. And so by the 1840s, in 1843 is the first Michigan Colored Men's Convention. And again, so we're what, 6 years out of being a state. And that Colored Men's Convention is attended by people like Asher Array, Nelson Ockrey down in Sharon, J.W. Brooks of Pittsfield Township. So immediately we have black politics. Immediately we have black politics. And I want to encourage any of you who want to do a real deep dive into black history in Washtenaw County to read the Michigan Colored Men's Convention's histories. They are extraordinary documents, and you're going to see the roots of what we might even call black nationalism, of an African identity, of thinking about of the diaspora of Africans and thinking about the Haitian Revolution. For these people had a very large world, a political world that they were connected through the anti-slavery struggle, from the Caribbean to England, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's really important. And it's out of also these first families that we're going to get the first black congregations. So the Brooks, he will be a lay preacher. He's actually has a fascinating history. I wish we could do a whole 2 hours on him. But he will be a formative person in the creation of these black institutions here. Okay, so abolitionism in Washtenaw County. Now, abolitionism, first of all, let's think about what it meant to be an abolitionist in the 1840s and 1850s. What you were talking about, to be a true abolitionist, and a true abolitionist meaning the immediate ending of slavery without compensation and full rights for the formerly enslaved, right? That would be your radical abolitionist plank. And that would be as far as you could go. What you were really calling for was the overthrow of the US government and the dispossession of the wealthiest people in America. That's what being an abolitionist meant. It meant that the people who have the most power in society should be stripped of that power, and that power be given to the people with the least amount of power in society. That was a revolutionary opinion. And it didn't get you, if you were white, it didn't get you invited to a lot of dinner parties. It made you somebody who wanted to overturn all the ways we do things, to overturn the way we speak, who we marry, where we live. It made you a very dangerous person, right? And so you would be attacked. It was something like being a communist in the 50s, right? You kept your head down. It's not something you advertised. And Ypsilanti likes to think that it has this strong abolitionist tradition. We know the votes of abolitionists in Ypsilanti. It was not a strong abolitionist tradition. The votes for and this is one of the strongest areas of the Liberty Party, which is obviously a white political party, because black people can't be members of this political party, that is a political abolitionist. They think that the Constitution is a means to get rid of slavery. And so they're going to intervene in politics and try with their Liberty Party to intervene in that way. And they get just about 3% of the vote in Ypsilanti, less than Ralph Nader got at the highest that he would ever have gotten, right? So for white folks, you were a small minority. And also, I think that this notion that it was wealthy white folks who were involved in the abolitionist movement is absolutely false. We know when in the white community, when big abolitionists come to Ypsilanti, white or black, they can't stay so William Lloyd Garrison comes to Ypsilanti and he's the foremost white abolitionist in the United States. He is denied being able to stay at the at a hotel here because of his politics, and he stays with a poor Irish immigrant who works on the railway, who invites him into his home. And we know that there was a white family, a poor white family, possibly the same family that lived over where Peninsular Paper is right now. They lived by the railroad tracks, and they opened their home up as a school for poor white and poor black children in the 1850s, right? So these, I think that we need to challenge a little bit about who was an abolitionist and who wasn't. The vast majority of Ypsilanti's great and good were absolutely pro-slavery. In fact, the congressperson sent from Ypsilanti to the U.S. Congress during the Civil War, or after the Civil War, is a guy named Lyman Norris. He is buried right here in Highland Cemetery. Lyman Norris was the lead counsel for the family who owned Dred Scott. He took the job from Ypsilanti to go out to Missouri because he was ideologically pro-slavery. This is the Norris family. We have a Norris Street in Ypsilanti. We have a Norris House in Ypsilanti. And for many years, the Norris family was considered abolitionists in Ypsilanti. Why were they considered abolitionists? Because they were immigrationists. They were against slavery in the United States because they were against any people of African descent being here at all. So that's why they were against slavery. So even after the Civil War, the Norris family favors immigration, right, of black people back to Africa. So they're anti-black, they're not anti-slavery, and that is the leading family here. And so also, I think we need to think about what it means for black people and for white people to be abolitionists. If you were black and an abolitionist, does that mean you vote? Does that mean you petition your government? Does that mean you go to a trial? You can't do any of that, right? Only white men are allowed access, and they're often only property owning white men are allowed access to the political system. So to be an abolitionist for a black person is entirely different than it is for a white person. And again, what we were saying about the number of white people who were abolitionists. So let's say 3%, something like that. 3%. What is the percentage of black people who are abolitionists? 99.9%, right? So when we think about who are the abolitionists and who aren't, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, we really need to center black people who are obviously the center of this movement. There would not be a white movement in support of an anti-slavery struggle if the people enslaved themselves weren't struggling against it. That it would never have happened, right? So the black families like the Arrays, the Days, the Stewarts, and the Ocros are involved in the Underground Railroad. We do have some pretty remarkable um, uh, hints of the Underground Railroad in this area. There was a radical Quaker community who were led by a man named Sam Moore. And if anybody knows, there's a little Quaker cemetery down on Bemis where a lot of black families are buried, including John Burton, the former mayor of Ypsilanti. And the reason I think some black families might not know that the reason that black families are buried in this little cemetery way down in Bemis is it was a radical Quaker cemetery in the 1850s, and it was not a segregated cemetery. So you went down there, and there. Let me just. I won't read this, but the PDF is in here, and I urge you to read these accounts of area abolitionists, white abolitionists. Okay, so lines and borders, the Underground Railroad in the landscape. Now, we have all seen this image of the Underground Railroad, and it purports to show the routes of the Underground Railroad. So let's unpack this a little bit because, frankly, this is a mythologizing of the reality. There is no Underground Railroad. There is no meeting where people get together and decide that you're going to go here and you're going to go there. There is certainly not like, if you're held in bondage in Kentucky, you don't get a postcard someday saying, congratulations, you won an paid trip to Canada, dress warm. That's not how the Underground Railroad happened. A lot of first it begins with the person escaping themselves, right? And so think about what we say about the Underground Railroad. We talk about conductors, we talk about station masters, and we talk about passengers. But a person, what is a passenger? They just sit there. right? If you've been in a car, is that how anybody escaped from slavery, by being a passive passenger? Absolutely not. The person escaping slavery was their own conductor, was their own passenger, their own station master. They were the person who had to decide, do I trust this person? Do I not trust that person? Do I go east? Do I go west? All of it depends on the actions that they're taking, not the actions of aid. And when we make the Underground Railroad the action of aiding people in escaping from slavery, then it can become a white story. When in reality, of course, escaping from slavery is a black story, right? And so when we think about the Underground Railroad, don't think the rich white person's attic in Ypsilanti where somebody hid. Because guess what? If you were coming through Ypsilanti, the very last house you would go to is a rich white person's house looking for, that's the very last place you would go to. The very first place you would go to is the black church founded by black people who had just escaped from slavery themselves. Brown Chapel AME, Second Baptist Church, a whole community in the South Side that was developing around that. So the Underground Railroad is centered in the black community. There is definitely heroic white assistance, but it only is assistance to what's going on in the black community. And and these are largely ad hoc, right? These routes, this is just how anybody would get from point A to point B, right? So there were some very organized bodies, and we'll talk about one or two of them, but most of this was ad hoc. You know, does if you does are you an activist on the Underground Railroad if you look the other way when somebody's running? Are you an activist if you give $1 at the church plate? Are you an activist if you hide some? Are you an activist if you have a conversation? Right? It's just like today. You know, there are levels of activism, and you know, you might be opposed to something, but you might not do anything about it, and you might what you do about it might be to look the other way, right? And then on rare occasions, you would for those really invested, politically active people, you would invest your life, like John Brown, you know, into this struggle. But the people who invested their life into this struggle are a small group of people. They're the vanguard that are leading a much more passive group of people that can be called on every now and then, here and there, right? And so this is an ad hoc system. It's not a system. It's not a system. It's not a system. But it is important, again, the geography. So look where enslaved people are, Missouri and Kentucky. Those are the two closest places to Michigan. And I want to point out again that West Virginia was part of Virginia and a slave state at this point. So just over the Appalachians there. So when we see where people come from when they're coming to Ypsilanti, it's from Missouri, it's from Kentucky, and it's from this part of Virginia. If you were held on this side of the Appalachian Mountains, you would come this way. So that we will see that, and that will mean that people from certain geographic regions end up in Ypsilanti. Okay, the North Star. So again, people are going to Canada. They are not coming to Ypsilanti. I guarantee nobody in North Carolina knows where Ypsilanti is, but they probably have a sense that Canada is north, right? And North Carolina is a good example of how we can follow groups of people in this landscape over time. So North Carolina had a strong Quaker tradition, and it probably had more free blacks than most any other state in the South, except maybe Louisiana. And after Nat Turner's rebellion in the 1830s, it became very, very dangerous to be free or to be an abolitionist in the Carolinas. So we see in the 1830s whole communities of white Quakers and free black families from North Carolina move first to Indiana, southern Indiana. Then those same communities after the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act will move to Canada, to Buxton or to Chatham. And then after the Civil War, that community will come to Ypsilanti. So literally, we will have a family living on the same street on South Adams Street that they lived 3 generations before in North Carolina, right? These families move through this landscape together. They have a tradition. they have political traditions, they have religious traditions, all of that kind of thing that they're bringing with them through these landscapes. So those families are the Kersey families, the Artis's family, the Travis family. There's a bunch of other names we can give for those families. But people are going to Canada. And and Canada is very interesting because one, it doesn't have laws like the United States. So even though I think that we can exaggerate and say that Canada was a free place, but compared to the United States, it was. Compared to one of the worst slave systems human beings have ever produced, Canada was relatively free. That's not a big, that's not a big statement. But it does mean that you went to Canada. And when people are escaping slavery, think about what that means. If you escape from slavery, what does that mean for all the people who are left behind? Your escape may put them in danger. Often the bravest thing you could do was to stick around because you had to look after your family, right? You might have had an opportunity to get away, but doing that would have meant torture, death, selling of your family, right? So there's lots of reasons why people, uh, uh, you know, I think it's important to remember the story of the escape from slavery is the story of enslaved people escaping. That's what I'm trying to get at. That for every person who gets to Canada, there are 250,000 who don't, you know? And so your personal freedom, and also with the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, your personal freedom doesn't mean the end of slavery, or even the end of slavery for your family, or necessarily the end of slavery for you. We've seen 12 years of slavery. It's quite possible, based on your skin color, to be kidnapped and brought back into slavery. So escaping from slavery personally was one step. And what you would then, if you were conscious about this situation, which many of these people were, you had to destroy all of slavery to ensure your own freedom and the freedom of your family. So escaping from the bondage of slavery, you entered then into the political struggle against slavery, right? And so what we see is these communities in Canada where people are escaping to become areas of self-determination. People are trying to have as much self-determination as possible, right? And so Black institutions are formed, Black churches and Black newspapers. And we see these two newspapers here, the Provincial Freeman, and that is edited by I think it's the first newspaper edited by a Black woman in North America, Mary Ann Shadd. And then we have The Voice of the Fugitive, edited by the great Henry Bibb, who we don't hear much about because he dies before the Civil War. But he's a major figure in this area and in Ypsilanti in the Underground Railroad. And look at what the differences in the titles even say. Mary Ann Shadd says, we're provincial free. We're free in Canada. This is now our home. We're staying here. Henry Bibb says, the voice of the fugitive. We're fugitives in Canada. We want to return to the United States, a free United States. So even, of course, the Black abolitionist movement isn't in one mind. Just like the white abolitionist movement, there's divisions within the Black abolitionist movement. And we can see those divisions in the names of these newspapers, right? How to relate to the United States, to relate to it at all. By mid 1850s, Canada was just the first step on getting out of North America altogether. And we see people like Martin Delany, who also works with the Array family here to start the Liberian expedition to go back to Africa. We'll talk a little bit about that. So Canada is extremely important. Every single Black family in Ypsilanti before 1900 would have been connected to Canada. And there would have, and if you were here 50 years ago, 70 years ago, even then people would have talked about the Canadian churches and the Southern churches because you had, again, this Canadian community, some of whom have no relationship to the South at all, right? Like none at all. It's a very northern community, right? Very independent. So this is not a community from the deep South. This is a Canadian community born in the struggle against slavery. It is defined by that struggle against slavery. So in our own Ypsilanti, who is the founder of Brown Chapel AME. Now, Brown Chapel AME has been on the corner of South Adams and Buffalo since the 1840s. It was first congregation was held in a horse's stable there. It was a horse's stable. And the Isis Stewart and her husband owned that property and then gave it to Brown Chapel, who built in the 1870s a big wood structure. And then in 1904, the church that is still there. So there were people singing for freedom on that corner during slave times because it was founded by people who escaped from slavery. The person who dedicated that church and gave the land to that church is Isis Stewart, and you can see here the dedicatory stained glass window for her in Brown Chapel to this day. I just do want to read this because already this news, it says interesting relics of slavery days. This article is written in 1915 or so, and already in 1915, Black Ypsilanti has generations of history and tradition, right? And so Levi McQuan, the proprietor of the Coop Line, he wrote it was like a taxi service, has two relics of slavery days that he prizes very highly. One is a corn knife that is gilded and hangs in his parlor. It has a history connected with his grandmother, Mrs. Isis Stewart, who was a slave in Virginia. She was a determined color woman who, when she ran away, said she would never be taken alive. She had a particularly narrow escape in Reading, Pennsylvania, where the slave hunters were on her trail. They even came to the house where she was, but the disguise given by her friends helped to mislead them. At another time, while in the mountains, she met five panthers. I don't think panthers travel in packs, but that's okay. She always kept this corn knife with her, and she would have used it if necessary. And this is wonderful. The other relic is a conch horn used on the plantation. This she used very effectively one night when 25 showmen surrounded her house in Ypsilanti. So a racist attack on her house in Ypsilanti. When she refused them admittance and they threatened to break down her house door, she rushed for the horn and from the second story window gave some blasts on it, which made the showmen think that the day of Jubilee had arrived. It is reported the way the men tumbled over each other to get away was the most lofty tumbling ever seen in Ypsilanti. These are the stories Black Ypsilanti has already generations ago about their family in Ypsilanti generations ago, right? That's if we're going to talk about a community, a heritage. There's no community in Ypsilanti like Black Ypsilanti. There is no community that has that length of tradition, that has the stability until very recently with gentrification. Ypsilanti has a special Black community. And between around the Civil War and the about 1920, that Black community is the largest by percentage in the state of Michigan. So let me say that again just to underline what that means. So it doesn't mean that Ypsilanti had the most number of Black people. That would have been Detroit. But as a percentage of the population, Ypsilanti has the highest percentage of Black population of any city in Michigan. So again, in 1900, Michigan is far less than 1% Black, far less than 1% Black. This is before the Great Migration. Detroit is about 1% Black. Ann Arbor is about 3% Black. Ypsilanti is about 15% Black, which means, and then in one ward, the first ward, which means that little Black Ypsilanti has a political weight that big Black Detroit doesn't have. It can determine one seat in city council, even in the 1890s, right? Even in the 1890s. And for a Black community in the North or anywhere in that period to have that kind of power was unusual. Now, that didn't mean that a Black person was going to get elected, but the white person chosen by the Black people from the South Side could be elected. And I think that's important. So Black people did play a very big role at that time in the Republican Party. Obviously, it's a very different Republican Party than it is today. So where are people coming from? Let's look at where people are coming from in 1860. And this tells us a lot about that movement and the struggle against slavery. So what's fascinating is already by 1860, about a quarter of Black people in Ypsilanti say they were born in Canada, right? And so automatically, if you say I'm born in Canada, it takes off the table. Are you running away from slavery or not. So lots of people lied and said, I'm born in Canada. And it's very interesting to see the 1870 census, and the same people who say Canada in 1860 after slavery is over will say, yeah, Kentucky, right? So that Canada figure is both true. There's lots of back and forth. There's already a generation that has lived in Canada and are coming back and forth over the river, but it's also a lie given to the census takers to hide that you escaped from slavery. Then we have about 10, 15% born in Michigan. Again, this old black communities in Michigan that start with the very first American communities here, and then other northern, and those are largely people from Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, getting away from the black codes, right? And then, so the people born in slave states, think about what's close. And, if you are trying to get from Louisiana to Canada, think of how difficult that is compared to getting from Missouri to Canada, right? If you're in Louisiana, you might try to get to Mexico, right? And if you're far out in Colorado or Wyoming, you might try to get to where Seattle is, right? So it wasn't people. We think of north as the only option you had, but it's not, right? There were other places to go, and if you were in the deep south, you went those other places. So we can see that by far, almost half of people who are born in slave states living in Ypsilanti in 1860 are from Kentucky. That is the closest slaveholding state. The others are, those kind of border states, Maryland, Delaware, Virginia. The Carolinas are that community that I'm talking about, the Quaker community. And then look at just a very small group from the Deep South, very small group from the Deep South. Here's some names you see on the lower left-hand side of the people who come in this period. These are all families that are still in Ypsilanti, that are in the record in Ypsilanti by the Civil War. And here's a few of those freedom seekers. I have dozens and dozens of notices, mainly obituaries. I think one of the things is, especially there was at the time a lot of people who had been held in slavery were dying. So the last people held in slavery were dying around 1910, 1920. In that period, that was the nadir. That was Jim Crow. That was the worst sort of racist period in American history. And so a lot of people hid the fact that they had escaped from slavery because they were ashamed of it. Of course, now we would be proud that we had ancestors that were who had escaped from slavery, and we would be ashamed of anybody who held other people in slavery. But back then, people were ashamed of it. So they didn't give accurate accounts often of their slave pasts. And so it is rare to get a full accounting of people's pasts, because the social pressures at the time said, don't talk about it. Don't talk about it. But we have so many, and I want to share briefly the story of Isaac and Lucy Berry here. And you can see this is an interracial couple, a remarkable group. Isaac Berry is held in slavery in Missouri, right near Hannibal, Missouri. So around the time Mark Twain is living there, maybe Mark Twain saw Isaac Berry. And Isaac Berry falls in love with Lucy. Lucy is a poor white woman. Her family are not slave owners. They're a poor white family that lived near where Berry is held. This is an illicit affair. This will get you killed, right? But they love each other, and they're going to try to get to Canada, but of course they can't travel together. She can travel freely over land, but he has to travel by foot. And this is where Ypsilanti's actual railroad does come in very handy, because the Underground Railroad, that's a metaphor, right? There's no railroad and it's not underground. But our actual railroad that goes through Depot Town here, it by the 1850s, it went all the way from Chicago on the Michigan on the border with Illinois to Detroit, right? And Chicago is 100 miles from Missouri, where slavery and where he was, right? So if you could get to Chicago, all you had to do was find that railroad, and you could travel at night without ever asking for directions, without getting lost, and you could do it kind of on your own, right? And so we do see a number of people coming through on that railroad, again, on their own, making the decisions on their own. And we have the story of Isaac getting into Ypsilanti and being actually asked by a black man who sees him walking the railroad, "Are you escaping from slavery?" Isaac doesn't know what to say because that's a tough question to, you don't know who to, you don't know who's asking, right? And it takes him a moment, but he's invited to a home. Black Ypsilanti comes to that home, brings food, brings new socks. He talks about how sore his feet were and how bloody and bruised his feet were. Give him a couple of dollars and tell him how to get the rest of the way to Canada, right? That's just one little incident, but I imagine that happened dozens, hundreds, hundreds and hundreds of times, right? And that was so, both Isaac doing it entirely himself and getting little pieces of assistance like that along the way. I again encourage people to read that these stories. H.P. Jacobs is one of these people who escaped from slavery, and he is perhaps the most important person, black or white, male or female, to ever call Ypsilanti home. He is a major figure. And let me just say a little bit about him. He was one of the founders of Second Baptist. He's one of the founders of the black school system here in Ypsilanti. He was born in slavery in Northeast Alabama. His slave name was Samuel Hawkins. Samuel Hawkins. He was held by the same family for years, decades. And we don't know how long he had this planned. He was married and had children on this plantation. And he is, because we think he was the son of the white master, and we know his mother's name because he writes it down and he writes for father dead. We think that he is the son of the foreman or some sort of the slave master and his mother, who we know her name. But he's said to be too small to work in the field, so he's given charge of taking care of an elderly insane man. And I've looked this all up. This is real. We have all of their names. And in that process, he learns how to read and write, which is illegal for him to do. And in 1856, he will forge the freedom papers for himself, his wife, his children, and brothers-in-law. He will expropriate the master's cart and horses and make it from Alabama to the Detroit River in less than 3 weeks. At the Detroit River, he is baptized in the Detroit River. He sheds his slave name of Samuel Hawkins and takes the name H.P. Jacobs. And I forever wanted to know who in the world is H.P. Jacobs, because his daughters continue just, sort of like a second wave feminist or third wave feminist, hyphenated names. His daughters continue to have the name Jacobs for their whole lives. They hyphenate their names, Jacobs. So I thought, well, they're paying homage to their father. Jacobs is taking the name of his wife, Louise Jacobs, and I think the daughters are honoring their mother, Louise Jacobs, by taking her name. How amazing. H.P. Jacobs makes it to Ypsilanti. He is clearly a person of an exceptional ability. And the best job that a black man could get in Ypsilanti, by a long shot, was the janitor at Eastern Michigan University. So you see the leading black men of Ypsilanti as the janitors of Eastern Michigan University. You had a salary, you were not paid by the day. You lived on campus. You had the authority of being employed by the state, right? So it was considered the best job for a black man. Now, that should say a lot about the differences between white and black Ypsilanti. Is it conceivable that the leading white male figure of Ypsilanti would be a janitor? It's inconceivable. To this day, it's inconceivable that it's going to be an owner of something, right? It is not going to be a janitor. But we have a different class relations for black people. So the leader of that black community is going to be a janitor. But that means that the demands then reflect the janitor instead of the mill owner, right? And so because of that class difference within the black community, black politics are different. Black politics are different. Now, he enrolls his daughters, Anna, Jewel, Lida, and Mary. And I think a couple of them aren't born yet, or they're born here, and one down in Mississippi. But they're told that they have to sit in the back 3 rows of Ypsilanti's schoolhouse. Now, he did not escape slavery to come to Ypsilanti to have his children sit in the back of anybody's schoolhouse. And so what H.P. Jacobs and other families do is they, with all the black families, withdraw their black children from Ypsilanti school and demand full access first, which they don't get, to the white schools. And then after the demand of full access is denied, then we want as much self-determination as possible. We want a black principal, and we want black teachers, so our children are not humiliated by white racists every day in school. So because of segregation, Ypsilanti gets the first black principals and first black teachers in Michigan, right? I think a lot of people here will think of Eugene Beatty as the first black principal. That's in 1949. The first black principal, I think, is in 1869. And I can say a little bit about him, but we don't have a whole lot of time to do that. He's also here the founder of Second Baptist. And then the delegate of the 1863 Colored Men's Convention, which meets in Ypsilanti. We'll talk about briefly to discuss how to respond to the Emancipation Proclamation. So H.P. Jacobs, so he plays a leading role. He's the leading black figure of Ypsilanti in the Civil War Reconstruction period. Immediately after the Civil War, he goes down to Natchez, Mississippi, in Adams County, Mississippi. And Adams County, Mississippi is to this day 80 or 90% black. So it's one of the most black counties in Michigan or in Mississippi. And again, black people had rights to vote in Mississippi before they had rights to vote in Michigan, right? Mississippi had Reconstruction by 1868, which H.P. Jacobs helped write the Reconstruction laws. So he goes down to Mississippi in 1866 to open a school for newly freed black children. And he brings his daughters, who are 12, 13 years old and have learned how to read and write at Eastern Michigan University, are the first black graduates that we know of Eastern Michigan University. They're going to the junior part of it. And they go down and open a school called the Natchez Seminary for people in Mississippi. Today, the Natchez Seminary is called Jackson State University. So the founder of Jackson State University is the janitor at Eastern Michigan University. So how many janitors should be founders of universities, and how many founders of universities should really be janitors? H.P. Jacobs is the challenging question. That's the challenge for us all, right? While he's there, we know when he arrives because a white man calls him a nasty name on the street, and he tries to get that white man arrested. That in Mississippi in 1868. He's voted 3-time Mississippi state senator. And he's voted onto Natchez City Council. While state senator, he rewrites the Mississippi Constitution and leads the fight for 2 incredibly important amendments to the new Constitution. One, you cannot be enslaved again for debt. Right. So black people have no money. You get out of slavery, you're immediately in debt, and then you're back in slavery by a new law to work off your debt. So he puts a law into that you cannot be enslaved for debt or imprisoned for debt and forced to work. The second one he puts in, which also helps white people out, right? And the second one he puts in is the most profound, which is it's free education for everybody, white and black, poor, universal education until 16 years old. At that point, it was 16. So most white folks could not read in Mississippi in 1860. The vast majority could not read. If you're white in Mississippi and know how to read and write, you can thank H.P. Jacobs, right? Black freedom tends to liberate everybody. And the Reconstruction says that more than anything else. All the gains won by black people in Reconstruction went to everybody. It was a huge expanse of rights there. He also, I mean, we could talk more about, he sets up the Jacob Benevolence Association to try to collectively pool resources to buy old plantations and work them together. He is an extraordinary figure. He becomes the head of the Mississippi Baptist Convention. So he starts almost all of the post-Civil War Black Baptist churches. He is allied to the most radical elements of the Republican Party at the time. He's a rival to another black leader in Mississippi who's quite famous named John R. Lynch. And he comes up, his daughters then returned to Ypsilanti and will live here. The last of his daughters lived in this area and died in the 1950s, everyone. So there are people who may have living memory of H.P. Jacobs' daughters in this area. H.P. Jacobs will spend his life in political activism, but he will come back to Ypsilanti on numerous occasions to visit his children and to speak at Emancipation Day events, to lead parades, etc., etc. And you see, he's Reverend H.P. Jacobs, M.D., because at the age of 65, it was not enough to be a political person, a religious leader, an educator. He wanted to care for black bodies as well. And he graduated the Louisville Medical School at the age of 65 and became a medical doctor. He died in 1899 in relative poverty and does not even have a grave marker for his grave in Natchez, Mississippi. A few years ago, we worked with Ypsilanti High School and the wonderful art teacher Lynn Settles to do a mural of H.P. Jacobs on one of the last surviving buildings of Ypsilanti's historically black business district on Harriet Street. I could give a whole lecture on H.P. Jacobs. He is a remarkable figure and an example of he's the best example, perhaps, but this is the kind of community. H.P. Jacobs is an example of the kind of community that Ypsilanti was. Okay, I know I've got to speed it up here, so let's. Okay, so the 1863 Michigan Colorsmen Convention. So this incredibly active, politically engaged community is also and involved in the Underground Railroad in this area, and they're closely connected with a Detroit group called the Order of the Men of Oppression, and they're a secret society led by George de Baptiste and William Lambert, connected to the John Brown movement. And they're within the Black Masonic Hall, the Prince Hall Masons. And this is a secret society that has agents in the South to help people escape through Detroit to Canada. They are armed in Canada, and if you get into trouble, they will get you out of that trouble and get you, or in Detroit. They are armed in Detroit and will help you get out of trouble. They will execute you if you are an informer, right? This is a life and death struggle, right? Informing on people escaping from slavery was serious business. And we do have even details of black informers taken out by these revolutionary groups and taken care of around Detroit, because that's the level of conflict and this was a real struggle. This was a struggle with an institution as violent as slavery. Remember, it took the Civil War and 750,000 dead to destroy slavery. It was not going quietly. It was not going quietly. And so in 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation, and as we all know, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free anybody. But the most important for our story, what the Emancipation Proclamation did do, and this is key and changes the whole character of the war, is it allows for black troops to be recruited into the Union Army. So again, these are people who had no rights before 1861, not a single right. And now you're giving people who have escaped slavery guns to go down to the South to fight slavery. This has changed the character of the war. Whether Lincoln and all of them wanted it or not, the folks that live in Ypsilanti were determined that this war was not going to be a war to save the Union, but a war to end slavery. Wars can be many different things for different people. For Black Ypsilanti, this was a war to end slavery, and that's how they dealt with it, and that's what they pushed for. And the reason any of the Civil War takes on its revolutionary role is because black people are pushing for that revolution to happen, and people are escaping from slavery in the South. And so what happens in 1863 is Black Ypsilanti hosts the Michigan State Colored Men's Convention to decide what to do about that Emancipation Proclamation. And all the people you see here participated. So this is George de Baptiste. This is Martin R. Delaney, the founder of Black nationalism, who was often in Ypsilanti, part of the Liberian exhibition, and a comrade of John Brown's, and then William Whipper. And you could see this notice in the Liberator newspaper about the Ypsilanti meeting. And what Black Ypsilanti and Black Michigan says is, we will fight for the Union, but first you've got to take the word white out of your Constitution, the state and national Constitution. Just take the word white out, and then we will fight. So this is a community making demands on the U.S. government before they will participate in the war, right? And that's how confident and how determined this community met the crisis of the Civil War. It was going to be a war to end slavery, whether Lincoln and them had wanted it to be that or not. We were going to make it that. We were going to make it that. And Ypsilanti did a blood sacrifice for that. Many of you have seen this image. If you haven't seen the movie Glory with Denzel Washington and Morgan Freeman and Matthew Broderick, it's the best movie on the Civil War, which is saying nothing because there are no good movies on the Civil War, but it's the best movie on the Civil War. And this is what happened is the 54th Massachusetts, right? So why are a bunch of Ypsilanti people joining the 54th Massachusetts? The Massachusetts was the first state in the North that enrolled Black people. So as soon as the January 1st, 1863, states can start enrolling Black soldiers. Most of them don't. Massachusetts does immediately. So if you were eager to fight, no matter where you lived in the North, and you wanted to go right now, you went to Massachusetts in March. And so we see three groups of people leave from Ypsilanti, organized by the Masonic, the Prince Hall Masons, to go to Boston, just west of Boston, to join the 54th Massachusetts in the spring of 1863. We have about a dozen and a half people. Some arrive too late and then are put into the 55th Massachusetts. By a quirk of history, the 55th Massachusetts, the 54th Massachusetts, and the Michigan-raised Ypsilanti 102nd United States Colored Troops will all be reunited and serve together in the war. It's a remarkable history. So people who separated before, and they will have Ypsilanti Masonic meetings off the coast of South Carolina of these three regiments, right? So they're bringing their traditions, and they will even have Emancipation Day celebrations. Again, not celebrating Juneteenth, but celebrating the end of slavery in Canada. They will celebrate Emancipation Day in the Carolinas by receiving new weapons on August 1st, 1864. And it was white officers. Now, the 54th Massachusetts is different because a lot of the Black units you could not be a Black officer. So all of the Black units are going to be officered by white men. Many of those were people who could not make it in white units and were careerists and et cetera, et cetera. Very few of them were committed abolitionists. The 54th and 55th Massachusetts, these were abolition fighters. These were revolutionaries. Literally the people who fought with John Brown, who gave him money. They would become the white officers. So they were committed to this abolition struggle. They were willing to die for it. In fact, they would die for it. And so these white and Black soldiers from all over, it's called the 54th Massachusetts, but remember, it's from all over the North, are the first to get in the field in the South from the North. There are other Black units out west and here and there, but they're the first to get in the field from the North. And this is in 1863, all the way 2 years into the war. And in July 1863, they're off the coast of South Carolina, off the coast of Charleston, which is the seat of the Confederacy. And the Union has sat off the coast of South Carolina for the last couple of years, not being able to make it into Charleston because of these big forts guarding the harbor. And they were impregnable. And white officers, the white leading staff, thought, believe it or not, that Black troops were docile, had been made docile by slavery, and would not fight, would not engage in combat. And so were very reluctant to use Black troops because they feared also that they would be accused of sending them out to their deaths. And so what it required was black troops to demand to take part in an action and prove that they could do it. So Gold Shaw, the white officer you see here meeting his death, demands to lead a suicidal charge of his unit on Fort Wagner to prove in a blood sacrifice the willingness of black men to fight and die. And that is what they did on that day. And we'll look at their names. So Ypsilantians in the 54th, the 55th was not there. The 54th Massachusetts were there. And Ypsilanti men died on that field. They gave that blood sacrifice. So Charles Augustus was 30. He's a blacksmith, Company I, wounded, missing, presumed dead, Wagner. Solomon Day survived. Napoleon Hamilton survived. John Leatherman died. He was wounded at Wagner and captured. And you can imagine being captured by the Confederacy. And he dies at a prison camp in Andersonville. Uh, and uh, and there's actually he leaves behind. He's married to the daughter of Isa Stewart, the founder of Brown Chapel, and leaves behind a young a daughter. So he leaves a widow and a daughter who never met him. His daughter never met him. He dies before that. Daniel Ross is wounded at another battle. Elias Rouse, who's buried right here in Highland Cemetery, he's wounded in the wrist at Wagner. He comes back to Ypsilanti and he marries the widow of John Gay, who died of disease during the Civil War in the USCT, and they will raise their children together. So that Civil War both divided and brought families together. Charles Scott was wounded at Wagner and then killed at one of the final battles of the war at Boykins Mill. William H. Scott, his brother, was a waiter here in Ypsilanti at where the Blackstone bookstore is. In fact, it was a hotel. He's wounded at Wagner. John Bird dies of disease at Folly Island, South Carolina. William Casey, who is the oldest person in the 55th Massachusetts, and he is the man more than anybody responsible for giving the land to Second Baptist on Hamilton Street. And black troops were given $10 a month compared to white troops $13 a month. And in the 54th and 55th Massachusetts, both the white and black troops refused that money until there was parity between white troops. And William Casey signs a petition to President Lincoln, and because he's the oldest man in the unit, his is the last name, demanding equal pay with white uh, uh, soldiers, and they refused any pay at all until it was equalized. So they fought in the Civil War without a dime because it wasn't equal to white men. And eventually they did win, and they won all of their back pay. And here are the list of, I wish I could tell you all of their stories. There's John Anderson. He lived on South Adams Street. His enslaved name was Edmund. He escaped also from Missouri. And his son, Alfred Anderson, became the first president of the local NAACP, and Alfred Anderson's son, George Anderson, became a leader of the UAW here in Ypsilanti in the 1940s. So what is the legacy of the Underground Railroad? In part, it's the NAACP and the UAW. That's the stories people heard at the breakfast table. They heard the stories of John Anderson, right? They come from that tradition, from that tradition. Frederick Douglass is in Ypsilanti 3 times, and because Ypsilanti is a constituency for black politics, almost every single black person of note in this period will come to Ypsilanti to speak here. So even though Ypsilanti is what 6,000 people with about 1,000 black people, Frederick Douglass feels he must come to Ypsilanti on every one of his tours. He comes in 1866. Speaks at Hewitt Hall, which is where the Mix now is. And he speaks on Lincoln's assassination. In 1867, he speaks on Reconstruction and Andrew Johnson. And if you want to know, where did Frederick Douglass stay when he was in Ypsilanti? I don't know about the first time. I don't know about the third time, but the second time, if you ever are at the corner of Huron and Cross Street, right by Riverside Park. There's that little. It's right by where the old City Hall is. There, you can see there was a building there, and that's C.R. Patterson's home. So he would have stayed in that home overlooking the Huron River in February 1867. I often think, did he have a window and looked out on the Huron River itself? 20 years later, he speaks in at the Ypsilanti Opera House, which is where Worth Theater is, and it's interesting. He speaks at Worth Theater in 1888. By 1895, a black man would not even be allowed in Worth Theater. Right. So we think that segregation was really bad, and then we've been picking away at it, and it's been getting better and better and better. No, segregation in Ypsilanti was relatively light in the 1850s and 60s and has been getting more and more severe since, right? So we've been getting more segregated, not less segregated. Celebrating the 15th Amendment. This is a remarkable. So when black men have the right to vote, one of those veterans of the 55th Massachusetts, who's a leader of radical black politics here in Ypsilanti in this period, Black Ypsilanti literally goes to Lyman Norris's the door of his offices and serenades him, saying, "We have all the rights you denied us yesterday with Dred Scott." You can read about it, them them calling out the U.S. congressperson in the middle of downtown Ypsilanti in front of his office. These were people who 10 years before had no rights at all, right? A revolution had occurred. I encourage you to read that. So I'm not going to go into all this right now, but we often think that Reconstruction just happened down south, but of course the whole country had to be reconstructed, and Michigan was able in the 1880s, with the United States retreating nationally, Michigan was able to put forward some fairly progressive anti-segregation laws by the 1880s. So in theory, it was illegal to have separate schools in Michigan. It certainly would be illegal to not serve people in a restaurant. By the 1880s, that would have been illegal. Now we have de facto segregation, right? And one of the ways we get segregation is we segregate on the basis of where people live rather than their race. And again, nothing in our landscape is there by accident. So post-war first, Reconstruction really was a moment of the bottom rail on top, at least for a moment, at least for a moment. So you could also see the Klan is active in Ypsilanti from the moment, like the Klan begins in Tennessee in 1867, and somebody in Ypsilanti must have heard about it that day, because within a week of the Klan being proclaimed in Tennessee, we see the Klan being proclaimed in Ypsilanti, right? So we know that there's Klan supporters in Ypsilanti back then as today. Uh, Sanford Wells is a leading figure in this period of Black Reconstruction. He'll end up going out to Colorado and starting a newspaper there. I wish I could say more about all of these people and characters, but this is showing you that what happens is a reaction. There is always a white reaction to Black freedom. And in part, what we're seeing today is a giant reaction to the Black Lives Matter movement of a few years ago. And there was a giant reaction to what was able to be achieved in Reconstruction with Jim Crow. And it was a violent reaction. It was extraordinarily violent to put Black people back into a position of servitude. It required as much violence as it took to place them there to begin with, right? It was a violent, violent, violent time in American history. Suffrage debates, because Black Ypsilanti is at the forefront of fighting for Black rights, that means that expansive notion of rights is here. So in 1874, the leading Black woman of her time, a wonderful poet and activist, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, comes to Brown Chapel AME. This is what, 7 years after, 6 years after the 15th Amendment, that Black men have the right to vote. and demands that black men use that right to vote to enfranchise black women. And here it says, every colored man and woman felt the full force of her remarks as she portrayed how, when the dark shadow of slavery rested upon them, they mutually suffered, and now being free, the justice and necessity of both clinging and rising together. So that's in 1874. Women would not get the vote until 50 years later, almost 50 years later. So how advanced, how in front is Black Ypsilanti? 50 years in front. 50 years in front on this issue, certainly. Okay, we talked about Emancipation Day. This is the most important day of the year. I would love it if Ypsilanti re-embraced this day, even though it was not a formal holiday, because no black person would go to work in Ypsilanti on Emancipation Day. They chose it as their formal holiday. Ypsilanti shut down. So, like, it's very unique, right? It's a unique thing that we have this informal but very real holiday where the whole city shuts down. So there are special trains that will come from Canada, from Jackson, from Detroit to come to Ypsilanti, which will host it once every 7 years. It'll be in Ypsilanti. And this will be celebrated on August 1st. It becomes less political and more social over time, of course, but it will be celebrated in Ypsilanti up until the 1940s, and is still very much celebrated in Canada, right across the river every August 1st. In fact, Canada now has an official Emancipation Day as part of their holiday system for August 1st, I think just in the last year or two. What you're seeing there is an Emancipation Day celebration in Amherstburg, right across the Detroit River in Canada. Okay, so just some snapshots of social life. We've been talking about politics, but this is a really active community doing all kinds of things. And you know, let's just look at a couple of them. The colored folks had a church social at Batchelder's Hall Christmas night. About 12 o'clock, some drunken rowdy came there and succeeded in getting up. Now, by being intimidated with some of the young ladies as a natural consequence, he got a chair smashed over his head, which led to the bringing things of a state in confusion and breaking up. There was a party that got out of hand. That happened too. S.H. Wells, the oldest barber in our city, has sold out to Mr. Butler, and he leaves for California. We wish him old. Now, this is the white newspaper saying that to this local leader of the community. The Heart Lodge of the Free and Associated Masons, and you look at those names, and those are all people who fought in the Civil War together. All people who fought in the Civil War. Al DeHazen will marry one of H.P. Jacobs' daughters, right there. The Colored Masons will hold their banquet throughout the city. The Second Baptist Church will hold on the fairground. That's where Recreation Park is today. The Jubilee Singers, Fisk Jubilee Singers, come to the Opera House, right? So this is an active community with a full social life, a full social life. And here's just a few of the photos of some of these the names. And there's Wealth of Sherman here. I wish I could tell you all of their names. But here's the family from Forest Avenue. Here's the arrays here. So it's very rare to have Victorian era pictures of black families, and we're lucky to have a few. Not enough, but these are some of them. I love this photo up here too of these children. I'm sure that I know their last names. I wish I knew their first names. Okay, the end of Reconstruction. There's a shift in national politics, the end of that Civil War alliance between Northern Republicans and Southern blacks. That's over with because the West opens up. So black people the Democratic Party was always a cold house in this period, and now the Republican Party is a cold house. The other thing is that because of the weight of Ypsilanti's black population, that weight allows for segregation to become a reality. Think about it. If you're in Eaton Rapids, Michigan, and you're a racist school board and you want to segregate all of the black students out, you have three black families. You don't make a whole new black school system for three black families, right? They will be internally segregated within the white one. But the weight of Ypsilanti's black community having such means you can have separate everything. Everything at a certain point in Ypsilanti will become separate, right? And so because of the weight of Ypsilanti's black community, we in fact see more segregation in Ypsilanti, not less, right? because it's institutionally possible on a really broad space. And in fact, Ypsilanti will become geographically segregated, where we'll have two separate business districts, white and black business districts. Very few other cities would see a situation like that in that period in Michigan. It's almost unique to Ypsilanti. Um, uh, these this continued support for the Republican Party is a problem because there is no recourse, political recourse. So all of those actions that you saw in Reconstruction period that at least black men could participate in are now shut off, right? So we get a giant retreat in politics in this period in the 1890s or so. And Jim Crow is real in Ypsilanti. And just because it's not legal and formalized doesn't mean it's any less prevalent. And we'll give some examples. These are newspaper articles for the time. They will speak in the language of the time. Um, but I think it's important that when Ypsilanti pats itself on the back and tells you what a progressive city it's always been and how it's been, one of the beacons on the Underground Railroad, that we push back and go, that is simply not true. And if that were true, then why in the world are we so segregated today, right? It's simply not true. And the truth is the only way to understand the way we live today. If we tell ourselves myths about the past, it doesn't illuminate anything about why we live where we live today. And so what we get is real segregation. And I want to show you this map here. And this is Black Ypsilanti around 1900. And here is the wards, Black Ypsilanti by wards. So look at what happens. In 1860, 25% of Black Ypsilanti lives in the first ward, about 7% second ward, 30% third ward, right? So you can see that no ward has a majority of black families in it. In fact, about a quarter, right? So black families are relatively evenly distributed around the city's neighborhoods and wards in 1860. As we get up and up, one of the things interesting here, this is Ward 4. So 18, that's Depot Town. That's Depot Town. And you notice between 1880 and 1894, Black Depot Town disappears and literally is burnt out. Right behind side tracks is a black tenement ran by a black landlady with a large number of black families in it. The local business owners get together with a wink and a nod and burn down the building in broad daylight to move black families out of Depot Town. And so that's what you see there. So segregation was sometimes it's where you got alone, and sometimes it's where the Molotov cocktail came through your window, right? It's how it was determined. So by 1900, about 85% of Black Ypsilanti is living in the first ward. By 1920, it's 93.6% of Black Ypsilanti lives in the first ward. So we go from very relatively unsegregated, at least in terms of where I know people are not singing Kumbaya and hugging in the streets, but I'm talking about where people are living in the community, right? Like Second Baptist is over on Hill Street on the east side of town at this point. It takes pressure. It takes social pressures to push Black Ypsilanti into the south side below Michigan Avenue. And it will take about 50 years to complete that process. But that process is, once it's completed, it's what Ypsilanti looks like today. So it took 50 years to complete that process. And if I say north or south of Michigan Avenue, you know exactly what that means, and you know exactly what that meant 100 years ago. And that meaning of north or south of Michigan Avenue becomes real. So we have one pool in Ypsilanti, one community pool. How do you segregate one community pool, right? So what Ypsilanti did was say, on Tuesday, if you live north of Michigan Avenue, you use the pool. On Wednesday, if you live south of Michigan Avenue, you use the pool. Everybody knows what that meant. We'll talk later about Ypsilanti's school decision, but Ypsilanti resegregated its school on the basis of where you live, right? So you go to school where you live, but we just saw that 95% of black people live in the first ward, so you will be going to an all-black school. That's just how segregation has worked. Now, here's the Ladies Literary Club, that wonderful building that you see that we all know. They're deciding, again, segregation comes in. People are deciding, shall we draw the color line, right? W.E.B. Du Bois said that's the question of the 20th century. Well, Ypsilanti was asking the question for sure, right? And the Ladies Literary Club asked, shall we draw the color line? And I wish I knew who this woman was. Here is a Black woman's response printed in the Ypsilanti Press. A colored woman of the city writes as follows to the editor in regards to the recent discussion of the Ladies Literary Club as to whether or not the Federation of Women's Club should draw the color line. Editor of Times. Before you draw the color line, I think it well to call a meeting to see if the colored ladies would care to join with the white women or not in their women's clubs. I don't think it is one of the colored ladies who has asked if they could become a member of your club. The colored ladies have a society of their own, and they don't consult the white ladies about it, and don't ask them to become members. The colored people of Ypsilanti have made themselves. That's from 1909, 1910. I would love to know who wrote that, but that is the community we're talking about. That's a Black woman in Ypsilanti in that period. And I want to end it there, I think. We've gone on pretty far, but we'll end with this: Black Lives Matter. So we all know how hard it is at this point in U.S. history to get a white police officer charged with murdering a Black person in custody. It's almost impossible. Even when it's live on television and everybody's watching it, it's almost impossible, right? Today. In the 1890s, how difficult was it? Well, it was at least as hard as today, and yet Black Ypsilanti is able to get James Eaton, a Cincinnati police officer, arrested and charged with the murder of Jake Griffin, a Black man, while in custody here in Ypsilanti. The meeting was held at, you can see this is the Masonic Hall today on South Adams in Buffalo. There was many meetings held there in support of justice for Jake Griffin. And a lead attorney, Black attorney from Barbados by way of Detroit, comes up and they need to get the trial moved from Ypsilanti because Ypsilanti is considered too racist to have a jury that would, so this Black a lawyer, and I'm blanking on the name right now, and it's going to come to me in a moment. It's just a brain thing. This lawyer, Straker, Straker is able to get the trial moved to a less racist city for the trial. Guess what? The less racist city that Ypsilanti is? South Lyon. And if anybody knows of South Lyon, that's saying something, that South Lyon was considered less racist than Ypsilanti. Now, Officer Eaton was acquitted and rehired immediately by Ypsilanti police force. And later that summer, in fact, that was the 1894 was a long, hot summer in Ypsilanti. There was a number of near riots in the city over this officer who was rehired by the city. Now, it's not, none of us are surprised that he was rehired by the city and he was acquitted. I think all of us should be astounded that he was brought to trial to begin with. That is the ability, the organization, and the demands of Black Ypsilanti, even in the period of the Nadir, the worst period of Jim Crow racism in America, right? Even then, Black Ypsilanti was strong enough politically to get a white officer arrested and charged with murder. That's an astounding statement about Black Ypsilanti in a period of deep racist reaction. So I will be happy to take any questions. You can type them out or talk. I know we've gone through a lot, and we're going to go through a lot more next week. I apologize for not getting to everything and